welcome back everybody to what is arguably the most important video of any F1 season. And that's going to be my top 22 drivers for the 2026 Formula 1 season. Now, obviously, when I came to making this, I completely forgot that it was to 22 drivers this season. Of course, I knew that Cadillac were joining, but until we get to the first sort of race, it's still kind of surreal to think that there's going to be 11 teams on the grid. So it's going to add an extra level of interest, I suppose, to making these predictions, because naturally you have two extra drivers on the grid, and especially in Bottas and Perez, you'd assume they're going to be pretty decent. So without further ado, let's dive straight in to my P22 of the 2026 season, and that is Valtteri Bottas. And I think the reasoning for this is not because I think Valtteri's a bad driver. I just want to clarify that. It's more so a case of I don't think Cadillac are going to be particularly strong, and that's from a multitude of different aspects, whether it's the fact that they're a new team, so the car development isn't going to be as experienced as other teams, or the fact that their strategy team is probably going to be a bit behind on others. Just pretty much every factor you'd expect them to be a bit weaker on. So, whilst I do think Cadillac aren't going to be a complete backmarker, I also don't think they're going to be beating any other team, realistically. Unless we get some sort of crazy race, which we might do, but I think Valtteri will be the last place in the championship. Don't want to see him there, but unfortunately someone has to go last. And so for P21 in the championship, I'm going to put Franco Colapinto. And this comes from the fact that firstly, I don't think he impressed that much in 2025. I think that's fair to say. And I am quite harsh on Colapinto purely because he was brought in as a replacement, as an improvement, but he hasn't really showed that particularly. So I am a bit harsh on him, but I don't see him doing well. Is that really so crazy of me to think? Like, because we haven't seen much from him since his Williams days in 2024, I don't get the vibes that he's going to have a good season. I really don't. Especially in this new era of car, where you've got to be so good at managing the energy systems. I just don't see it. I don't. So, unfortunately, Franco slots into P21 on the championship, and that moves us on to P20, where, unsurprisingly, we have the other Cadillac driver in Sergio Perez. And yes, that does confirm, I think, Perez will beat out Bottas this season. I do believe these bottom three drivers likely will have 0 points, assuming that the top 5 teams are so competitive that it's hard for midfielders to get into the points. I just think Perez will probably have a bit of decent consistency and get maybe a nice P11, P12, something like that. And whilst it's not great for Cadillac being 20th and 22nd in the championship, I think considering it's their first season, you don't really expect much more. So that's kind of the end of my... Well, not the end, but like, these are the sane predictions so far. Trust me when I say this, it's gonna get very, very diluted as we go through this. So buckle in, because it's gonna be a wild ride. Which will lead on to my P19 in the championship. And for P19, I've gone for Gabriel Bortoleto, who, of course, now will be driving in the Audi for 2026. And I think my reasoning for this one is it will only be his second year in the sport, and he did show signs of quite large inconsistency last season. He was very strong at some races, but then you had weekends like Brazil and Las Vegas where he really was poor. And I think with the Audi project, I see it being decent, but I don't see them breaking the top 5 teams, if I'm honest. Like, I think there's even more previously midfield teams that will have a better chance of improving than Audi do. Because I just think when you're making such a big new project, similar to Cadillac, even though Audi and Sauber have already been in the sport, I just see sort of like some growing pains in the sense that I don't think they'll hit the floor running. So that's why I've put Gabriel Bortoleto in P19, because I just don't think the Audi is going to be amazing. I don't think it's going to be as bad as the Cadillac, but I just don't see them being massively competitive. So unfortunately, that leaves Gabriel Bortoleto in a lowly P19 in the championship. But it could be worse. I think for the first year with a new team, that's not too bad. Which now leads on to my P18 in the championship, which for this year I have gone for Esteban Ocon. And I think we saw the warning signs last season in the sense that Ocon just wasn't on it at all, really. Like, he did have some good race performances, but if we're being completely honest, a few of those were from good fortune. Like, for example, he got massive points in China because of disqualifications in front of him. And yes, he was having a decent race before then, but it completely flatters his season. He was not performing well in 2025. And you can't really attribute that to too much, because the only plausible thing you could say is that he was getting used to the new team. But you've got drivers like Carlos Sainz, who got used to Williams. Yes, not straight away, but he did towards the end of the season. So I just don't know what's wrong with Ocon and Haas, because I don't think it's a lack of motivation either. And he wasn't good at the end of Alpine, if we don't forget. I know it was a very hostile exit from the team, but he was not good for 2024 in Alpine. So I don't know if Esteban Ocon is just lacking something, but unfortunately it leads me to putting him in P18 in the championship. And as you can see, beaten by his teammate Behrman. So not great from Ocon, but let's look at P17 next, where for this year I have Arvid Lindblad. Now, of course, he's coming in to replace Hadjar, who's replacing Tsunoda, for RB, VCARB, whatever the hell they're going to be called this season, God knows. But he's, of course, replacing them. And I personally am from the standpoint that he probably could have benefited quite well from another season in F2. I think this isn't to say that he's going to be terrible or off the pace. I just think when you look at his F2 season last year, he did have a lot of sort of rookie mistakes that another season would have flawed out before he comes into F1. Because Hadjar, for example, I do believe he did have that extra season to sort of let him hone himself in. Whereas Lindblad, I just think he's kind of been rushed into it. And I don't really know why they've rushed him into it, if I'm honest. But I think he won't be terrible, which is obviously why I've predicted him here. But I just don't see him being better than Lawson, if I'm honest. I think Lawson will have the measure of him. I think the VCARB, RB, whatever, isn't going to be the best car this season, as it often isn't. Because, let's be honest, like, they take inspiration from Red Bull, but, like, Red Bull just purposefully nerf them so that they don't beat Red Bull. Like, they're going to rarely be in the top 5 consistently. So, I don't think it'll be an amazing season, but I think he'll have a rookie season with some decent peaks, but I do predict a lot of scruffy mistakes, as we've seen from him in F2. So that's my prediction for Arvid in P17. And now we go on to P16, where for this I have gone for Oliver Bearman. Now, this is kind of coupling into the I don't think Haas are going to be amazing, and I think that's probably just because they have a small workforce, and yes, they were good on the new regulation set in 2022, but that was because they were underweight, not because they'd built a masterful car. It's just that a lot of other teams had literally given up free time because the cars were overweight. So I just don't see Haas having like an amazing 2026, if I'm honest. Of course, they've got the new sponsorship, I think, with Toyota Racing, I think. So they are going to have a bit of a rebrand, reprofiling, and I think that's good for them, having a bit more sort of maybe legacy in the sport, is fair to say, because like Haas as a name is just kind of, even though they've been in it for a decent while now, it's just like, who supports Haas, if we're being real? I know there's going to be a few people out there, but like, it's similar to Alpine. Like, find me someone who supports Haas. I genuinely haven't seen a single person. But I think Oliver Bearman will build on his previous season. I think, obviously, he will be ahead of Esteban Ocon. Just, you know, with more consistent results like we saw at the end of 2025, where even though I don't think the car will be as good relatively as it was last year, I do still think we'll see him in the points a couple times this year. And just having a more consistent season overall. Because that was the biggest problem with Oliver in 2025, really. He had a very good end to the season, but he had a lot of scrappy mistakes in sort of the mid-part, early part. So I think he'll have a very productive year in Haas to increase his stock, because his stock is already very high as a driver. And I think if he has a really great 2026, relative to the car performance, of course, but if he has a really great 2026, I think the Ferrari seat is looking very, very likely for him. And you'll see why later in my predictions. As I said, it's going to get a bit wild, so prepare for that. But I do think Bearman has a very, very strong chance at being in a Ferrari in the very near future. So keep an eye on that one. And that will leave Bearman in P16 in my standings. Now, for 15th place, I have gone for Isack Hadjar. And this, even though it's not a shock, if you look at the second Red Bull driver performance for the past few years, I mean, not with Perez, but like for the past few drivers, excluding Perez, this isn't a shock, because you'd be like, oh yeah, of course they're low in the standings, like the Red Bull's impossible to drive. But a lot of people have sort of, you know, got the belief that the Red Bull car is going to be fixed, it's going to be fair for both drivers next year, and that could be the case. It could be. I obviously have no information to say that's not the case, or whether it is. That might be true. They might just go from blank and be like, yep, let's give both drivers fair chances. But if we're honest, it's the Max Verstappen team. It's always going to be tailored towards Max, and Isack just has to deal with that, realistically. And I also don't think that the Ford power unit is going to be like amazing. That's why I've also got Arvid like down lower, because I don't think the V-carb will be particularly good either. And of course the engine this year is so crucial. And I just don't see it happening with Isack, if I'm honest. He's been rushed into that Red Bull seat. Yes, he had a very good rookie season, but the rookie season is meant to be a foundation for building in the future. Like, one season is rarely enough to become a whole rounded driver and then be promoted into the top team. I just think it was a bit rushed, and I do hope that he's more competitive than what I've predicted him as. I really do, because we want to see two Red Bull drivers. We have not seen that in so long. But part of me still thinks that, I don't know, I think Max is going to trounce him, and then sort of the mental aspect of that is pretty downtrodding to be so hyped in your rookie season, and then to go into Red Bull, and now you've got all the headlines saying, why are you 6/10 off Max Verstappen? I hope it's better, but unfortunately, I've got Isaac in P15. So, not a great year for him, if that does come out to be true, but my 14th place for 2026 is none other than Liam Lawson. So yes, that does confirm I think Liam Lawson will be the best, or the second best, Red Bull affiliate driver. And this largely just comes from the fact that, like I said, I don't think the Red Bull package, so for both teams, is going to be the best. I don't. And I think Lawson's just going to have a season like last year, where, excluding the first sort of quarter where he was recovering from being in the Red Bull, I just think he'll have some pretty consistent performances and ultimately beat out the two. Even though Isaac's not a rookie anymore, you have to say he kind of is a rookie going into the Red Bull as the main team. So I think Lawson's experience being in that second team is just going to make him the more consistent driver next year. So I don't think it's too spicy to predict that. And that's why I have him in P14 as the second highest Red Bull driver. So, pretty good year for him. And that leads on to my P13 of the year, where for this I have gone for Nico Hülkenberg in the Audi. And like I said for Gabriel Bortoleto, don't think the Audi's going to be amazing. The only reason I have Nico Hülkenberg up here is because I think he will have some of those very Hülkenberg-esque performances where on a certain race weekend he just has a really good performance. Like thinking of Silverstone last year, for example. I just think we'll have a couple of those throughout the season, and that's just going to inflate him up the championship. I don't think it's necessarily a car performance deserves to be in this position. I think it's more so a case of him as a driver is going to have some good, like, driver-defining races, and it's going to elevate him in the championship standings. So that's why I've put Nico Hülkenberg in P13. And the driver ahead of him in P12 is going to be Pierre Gasly. And even though I don't think Alpine's going to be great, I think one thing you must not ignore is that they're going to have the Mercedes engine for this year. And compared to that Renault E-Tech engine, you have to assume it's going to be leagues different, leagues better. And especially with Mercedes very early on being coined as the strongest power unit for this new regulation set, I think it's going to boost the Alpine performance a little bit. And you have to put a little bit of faith in Alpine to surely think that, considering how abysmal last year's car was, surely it's like a Haas 2021 situation where they realised they were so far behind and they've put everything into the new regulations. And if that is the case, you'd expect them to at least be at the top of the midfield. You'd expect that. So that's kind of why I've got Pierre up here. And also on top of the fact that I just think, similar to Nico Hülkenberg, I think Pierre Gasly is just going to have those sort of driver-defining races where, you know, he just chucks it in Q3 randomly and get the decent points all. I think that's what Pierre's going to do this year, as he has done last year, and he's going to wildly outperform Colapinto, which will put pressure on Colapinto's seat, actually, because if Pierre is doing this well, and Colapinto's like all the way down in 21st, that's not going to be great for his career, if I'm honest. But that's my thoughts on Pierre Gasly. And I think for you experienced fans out there, one thing you will be noticing at the moment is, where is Lance Stroll? And to that I say, just you wait. And it'll pay off very soon. But in P11, I have Lewis Hamilton. And I think this probably will annoy a few people, potentially, if you're a big Hamilton supporter. But my reasoning for this is, because I've ranked Audi and Haas as not being particularly good, the reason why I've done that is because I don't think Ferrari are going to have the best engine for this regulation era straight away. And of course, that's so crucial for this new regulation set, that your engine's good. It doesn't really matter how good your aero is if your engine's that bad. And that's what I'm thinking with Ferrari. I think all Ferrari powertrain cars are not going to be great. And on top of that, I just, based off of last year, where is the performance from Lewis Hamilton? Where is it? Because, again, like I say, you can't attribute it to lack of motivation, because he was incredibly motivated going into 2025. So if it's not that, then surely it's just a driver deficiency in the sense that he's not awful. I'm not saying he's a terrible driver, but he's not the Lewis Hamilton of years gone by. He's really not. And compared to Charles Leclerc, I mean, Lewis didn't even get a podium last year. And I know the Ferrari wasn't great, but it was a podium contending car at a lot of races. And I just don't see the upswing in performance for him. I know you could potentially say that the ground effect cars basically nerfed him into oblivion, but I genuinely, if that is the case, and I hope it's the case, then that's great. But part of me we haven't seen Hamilton as a great driver in ages. We just haven't. Like, 2023 was arguably, like, his best year in the ground effect era. And every single other one, he was just struggling like crazy. And if a driver can't adapt to a different rule set, then he's not a very good driver, I'm afraid, in my opinion. Because you look at Max Verstappen, for example, and he's been dominant in both eras. And you'd expect him to be very strong in this era. Of course, that can be proved wrong. But that's the hallmark of a great driver. You can drive anything. But if Hamilton can only drive a car that's the 2020 Mercedes, that's literally just glued to the floor and 1 second faster than everyone else, then that's not a good driver. And I don't think that was the case with Lewis. But you have to look at the 2022 ground effect era, and it's just not been impressive. And that's why I've put him so far down in P11, because I think that he's just lost something as a driver. I just think, whether it's just purely age, or he's become like self-conscious in the sense that he's not had great performances the last few years, I just think something's not clicking with Lewis. And I just don't think it's going to be a great season for him, especially when I think other teams are going to be much better than the Ferrari. So that's why I've got him in 11th. And that moves us nicely on to the most important part, the top 10 in the championship. And as you can see, the main teams missing from the bottom 5 are, of course, Aston Martin, Red Bull, Williams, McLaren, Mercedes. So obviously they're going to be in some order in the top 10. And the first team to round that out is going to be Williams, with Alex Albon in 10th. And this comes down to, they've got the Mercedes engine, so you'd expect them to be strong. And I think they're just going to build off of last year. I think they've spent a lot of time developing 2026's car, and I think it will pay off. I think James Vowles will produce a very competitive Williams car. Even though it's P10, I just think the other teams are going to be really, really strong, in the sense that because it's a new regulation era, you expect the sort of pace deltas between teams to be quite large. So P10 is more so a case of they've built a really good car, but not the best car. And I think they have to be happy with that, to be honest, going into a new regulation set, because they need to build on this, and they've got 2027 onwards to potentially become a podium fighting car. So I think it'll be a very strong season for Alex, but that season will be beaten out by my P9 prediction in Carlos Sainz. So yeah, I think Carlos will be the better Williams driver. And part of that, you could argue, is a little bit of recency bias, purely because he was much stronger at the end of 2025. But also, I just think he's got settled into that team now. And with the dynamics of how we go racing next year, I think it's going to play much more into his skill sets than Alex. So I do believe the Williams drivers are going to be close. That's why I put them 9th and 10th. But I do think Carlos will just slightly edge out Alex Albon over the course of 2026 and put himself in P9. So that's Williams sorted. Now we go on to P8 in the championship. And guys, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. So P8, I have Lance Stroll, the GOAT himself, the king of interviews, and if you watch the video, the winner of my 2025 awards show. And you know what? I know I'm biased. I'm going to take it. I like Aston Martin as a team. But Adrian Newey, Aston Martin car, I think Stroll's going to do pretty decently this year. Obviously not higher than the top 8, but, you know, we take those. Top 10 in the championship for Lance Stroll, that's a W of a year, if I'm honest. So, in all seriousness, I do attribute this to the car. Because you also have to factor in that Aston Martin are going to be the only team with the Honda engine, right? And even though we haven't had massive reports of, like, Honda being overpowered or anything, but if that Honda engine comes out the blocks and is, like, the best, then Aston Martin are just going to dominate, because they're the only team. Like, with every other engine, I believe, you've got multiple teams. Mercedes, you've got a long list of McLaren, Williams, etc., etc. And for Ford, you've got the 2 Red Bull teams. Ferrari, you've got Ferrari, Audi, Haas. Like, they've got other competitors, and I suppose Audi is the only one that's on their own, but they are a newcomer. So, I think part of the reason why I've got Lance Stroll this high is, unfortunately, because of the car. I don't think with, like, equal cars I'd put him this high, but I have faith. I'm a loyal Aston Martin fan, and I think they'll be good next year. So, Lance in P8, definitely going to be controversial for most people, and that's completely fair to say, but I have faith. Trust the process, and who knows, we might see a Lance Stroll podium. You never know. But in P7, back to sort of a more maybe not regular prediction, because in 7th I have the champion of last year, Lando Norris. So that's obviously a big shock, because, you know, he was world champion last year. But my reasoning for this is, I don't see McLaren keeping that performance, if I'm honest. Just something about the vibes of it, I don't see it. Because even though McLaren have had a really, really strong car for 2025, I sort of look at 2023 and 2024, where they had a really strong car towards the end of the season, and then they kind of just dropped the ball on, like, the beginning of 2024. Like, everyone expected at the end of 2023 for McLaren to be, like, easily top 3, but then they rocked up in 2024 and had a car that somehow got worse until they reached Miami. So I don't think McLaren are particularly great on, like, year regulation resets, because again, you look at 2022 and they were awful, like, absolutely terrible. And that's kind of my reasoning for this. Even though they will have the Mercedes engine, which is why they're not completely down the list, I just don't think McLaren are going to be the dominating force. And there's certainly an argument to say, why have I put Lando Norris behind Oscar Piastri? And when they're not fighting for race wins, I think the sort of early season consistency we saw from Piastri in 2025 is going to net him more points across the season, just purely based off of, scoring more volatile points within sort of the mid-pack of the field. So that's why I have Norris in 7th, only just edging out Lance Stroll. Who would have thought that? But in 6th, I then follow that up with Charles Leclerc, who, like I said, I don't think Ferrari are going to be great, but the reasoning for Charles Leclerc even being this high is just because he manages to sort of pull performance out of even like a struggling car. Look, you cite 2020, for example, where that Ferrari wasn't particularly good, but Charles Leclerc was getting absolutely everything out of it. So I think we're going to see similar this year. I do feel it's sad that Charles Leclerc isn't going to have like a really competitive Ferrari in my predictions, that is. I think it's a wasted talent, wasted potential. But unfortunately, guys, next year's your year, like being 2027, of course. This year ain't it. I just don't see Ferrari. I don't. Like, given how royally they messed up 2025, they can't recover from the loss there. Like, that was embarrassing beyond any levels. And I don't have faith in them anymore. I really don't. Like, I don't even think I had faith in them before. But, like, any faith I did have, that's... Even though I didn't know I had it, it's just lost. It's gone. It's dead. So, sorry, Ferrari fans. That's the best you're getting for 2026. And we move on to 5th in the championship. The top 5, the arguably really important positions, barring the top 3. And we kick that off with Oscar Piastri. And not too much to say. Like I said with Lando, don't think McLaren's going to be amazing. I think with the volatility of being in the mid-pack, it's not necessarily the better driver who always wins. It's just whoever's more fortunate in certain race outcomes. So that's why I have Oscar in 5th, really. Going to be a decent season for the car they'll have, but I don't see much more from McLaren, if I'm honest. So that's my thoughts on McLaren. And we move on to P4. And this might be a surprising one to some people, but I have Kimi Antonelli, who, of course, will be his 2nd season in the sport. But I personally think the last few races we saw from him in 2025 are going to be sort of like we saw with Piastri or with Behrman, for example, where like they kind of were building up to that point where everything just clicked, and then from there on out, they're going to be good. So I think that was the point for Kimi. And I do believe, even though he won't be the stronger Mercedes driver, I think we're going to see much more consistency from him this year. And with the Mercedes, that I think is going to be very strong next year, I think a P4 in the standings is very, very good for Kimi, if I'm honest. So that rounds out my top 4, 4th to 22nd in the championship. And now for the business end, the top 3. And if you haven't been following along, I guess, even though I suspect you have, but the 3 drivers left, obviously, are George Russell, Max Verstappen, and Fernando Alonso. Arguably, like, if we're talking a top 3 in the championship, that's like some of the best you could ever ask for, if we're being honest. That's like absolute cinema of a season if it's close. So, kicking it off with 3rd in the championship, I have Max Verstappen. So he is not going to become a 5-time world champion. And part of this, the reason why I have him in 3rd is, like I said, for every other Red Bull driver, I don't think the Red Bull is going to be particularly great in tandem with the Ford engine. So that's kind of why he's not winning the championship in my predictions, purely because I think it's just going to be him extracting the most out of the car, but he's not going to have the best car. In fact, I think he'll have the 3rd, if not 4th best car. So it's going to be a very strong season for Max Verstappen. It will be very much like 2025, where you'll probably look at it and be like, how has he got that performance from the car? Purely because I don't think it will be very good. So that's my thoughts on Max Verstappen this year. I don't think this is indicative of his performance as a driver. I just think he's going to get beaten out by other teams. And starting that off, we have the top two decider, George Russell or Fernando Alonso. Who's it going to be? And I'm sure if you've been listening, you know where my allegiances lie. So it's probably quite obvious, and it's very, very, very deluded. But in P2, I have George Russell. So you know who's world champion now, but just talking about George Russell first. I think he's going to have an incredible season. I think it's going to be a very close championship fight with him involved in it. And I think just the Mercedes and Mercedes engine package is going to be so, so strong, especially in his hands. And building off of 2025, where he had one of his best seasons in the sport, I think everything's looking good for Russell this year. And of course, like, if you take the delusion out of my predictions, I'd say it's quite likely you'd see a title fight between Russell and Verstappen, which is kind of what every fan wants, if we're honest. Like, that's going to be so, so good to watch if those two are going at it. But I just think it's going to be an incredible season for George, an incredible season for Mercedes, because I think the way I've predicted it, they're going to be comfortably first in the constructors' standings. So a lot to look for with Mercedes, really. So that puts them in P2. And then the moment that you're all waiting for, my P1 of the 2026 season. And the Adrian Newey copium is running through my veins. We've got Fernando Alonso. I mean, it's not just the car, okay? Let me explain myself. Even though I think the car is going to be the second best on the grid, it's more so a case of just these new regulation sets, where I've said it with a couple drivers, but I think especially with Fernando Alonso, I think the way he's going to manage the energy usage and just the race strategy, it just plays into his driving style so much. He's always been so good at race management, and I think with that being an even bigger focus this year, I just think he's going to do great. I really do. And even though it is a bit deluded me putting him first in the championship, I do hope that he's at least in the top 5 in the real thing. Because you have to have faith in Adrian Newey, surely. Like, he's renowned as one of the best race car engineers in history. So you'd hope that with a year of full focused work on 2026, you'd hope that they come out with a very strong car. And this also plays into the fact that I think if Honda make a good engine, then it just bolsters their chances of being good even more, because they're the only ones running it. So that's why I've got Fernando Alonso in P1 of the championship, and that leaves your championship order looking like this. And if the season does end like this, then I think it's going to be a pretty good season. Like, that's quite an interesting championship table, if we're being honest. And obviously as an Aston Martin fan, I pray for it to look like this. But even if it doesn't, I think broadly, I hope that I've got the team rankings roughly right. And of course, let me know in the comments what you guys think, what your predictions are for 2026. I'm sure all the Ferrari fans think this year's your year. And for your sake, I hope it is, but I just don't see it. But that's my thoughts on 2026. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll probably next be back for a livery tier list, probably, when all of the teams have released all of their liveries in the coming months. So I'll probably be back then. But for the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video, and have a great time watching all the livery unveilings in the coming months. So see you guys in the next video.